I've had a collection removed from my credit report in the last 72 hours. I have had a total of 6 collections removed from my credit report in the last 45 days. Now, you guys, I want you to let that sink in. I told you that to tell you that I have not paid a debt buyer in over 10 years. I know. When it comes to whether or not you should pay a collection, there are some things that you need to look at and determine first. But when it comes to a debt buyer is going to have to prove to me that they can legally collect on that debt, that debt legally belongs to me, that I legally incurred those charges. Like, they're going to have to show me that they can collect on the debt. They're going to have to give me everything that they're legally supposed to provide to me when I request it. They're also not going to need to make a mistake when they're communicating with me, whether it is in writing or verbally. Now, I said that to say, I'm not going to encourage you to pay a debt buyer, but when it comes to collections, there is a lot of confusion. So I want to give you the information and let you decide on whether it's in your best interest or not to pay a collection. I'm going to be going over some things that's going to help you determine on whether or not you should pay that collection. Now, this is going to be a lot of information, so I want you to, get with me, stick with me to the end of this video and try to understand everything that I am explaining to you. If you guys don't understand everything that I'm explaining, please let me know down under the comments so that I can give you or provide you with more information to make sure that you clearly understand everything, so that you'll know if you need to pay that collection or not. You guys, when it comes to paying a collection, there are 3 things that you need to determine. Number 1, you need to figure out who owns that debt. Who's actually trying to collect on that debt. Then number 2, you're going to need to figure out when was the last time you made a payment on that debt. The last thing we're going to be able to figure out is, should I actually pay that debt? Is it actually in my best interest? Let's go back to number 1 because it's very, very important. All of them are very, very important. So determining who actually owns that account. Who's requesting payment from you? Who are you supposed to be paying? You need to figure out who that company is. Is it the original creditor? Is it a debt collector? Or is it a debt buyer? If the original creditor is trying to collect on that debt, the original creditor can try to collect on that debt with an internal collection department, or they can reach out to a third party. They can outsource it and let a third party try to collect on that debt for them. But the original creditor still owns the debt. Okay? We're trying to figure out who owns the debt. We're trying to see if it's the original creditor, if they're the ones trying to collect on it, or is it a debt buyer? If it's a debt buyer, that means the original creditor no longer owns the account. The original creditor is not trying to collect on the account with an internal company or a third party. They have completely sold the account, and your account balance with the original creditor should be reporting 0 on your credit reports. Now, that means the original creditor no longer has ownership, but the debt buyer is now claiming to have ownership of that account because they've purchased it from the original creditor for basically, as they say, pennies on the dollar. Either the debt buyer owns the account or the original creditor. We're going to need to figure out who it is requesting payment. Okay? Now, once we figure out who owns the account, we want to figure out when was the last time you actually made a payment on that account. We want to know when the last time you made a payment on that account, because your dates of last payment determines whether you're still legally required to pay that account. That determines the statute of limitations on that debt. Now, the statute of limitations on debt is different in every state. You'll have to look up the statute of limitations in your state, the state where you currently live. If you open the account in another state, but now you live somewhere else, you have homestead somewhere else, you'll need to look at the laws in the state where you currently have homesteaded. Okay? Now, once you determine, and not only that, with the statute of limitations, sometimes the statute of limitations is different depending on the type of debt it is. So once you're determining the statute of limitation on that debt, make sure you're looking at whether it's for an open account, a revolving account, or an installment account, because that's going to matter. You're going to need to figure out the statute of limitation. And you guys, you can Google it to figure out the statute of limitations. It should take you to your state's website where you can figure that out. Now, that statute of limitations, that time, say if it tells you that account, the statute of limitation is 3 years. That time does not start when you opened the account. It's going to start when you made your last payment the month after. That's why it's important to determine your dates of last payment. Now, once we figure that out, who we owe and the age of the debt, what are we going to do with this information? Okay, let's talk about it. Once we figure out who owns that debt, we can figure out how to handle that account. We need to know who owns the debt, because if it's the original creditor, if the original creditor still owns the debt, they don't have to provide validation. They don't have to validate the debt, and they can never be considered a debt buyer or a debt collector. Now, that's important because once a debt buyer owns the account, we can use what they call the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act in order to request validation. The FDCPA, that law governs debt buyers, and that's normally how credit repair companies, or when you're sending letters to debt buyers, that's normally how we're able to get them to remove that account from your credit report. But remember, that law, the FDCPA, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, does not govern the original creditor, because they can never be considered as a debt collector. So you can't request validation from them. Okay, that's why it's important to determine who owns that debt. Because if it's a debt buyer, you can basically tell them you refuse to pay this debt until they validate that account per the FDCPA. 9 times out of 10, the debt buyer, they can't validate it, or they're going to make an error when they're communicating with you. Now, I know I also told you that the original creditor can never be considered as a debt collector. So the FDCPA does not govern them. That means that law will not work with them. Not only that, if you do pay a collection that's with a debt buyer, you can't request validation, which makes it almost impossible to get removed from your credit report. So if you do decide to pay a collection, if you don't have something with the debt collector or the debt buyer that states they're going to remove that account from your credit report once they receive payment, they do not have to remove that account. Just because you pay it doesn't mean it has to be removed. And after you pay it, the debt buyer doesn't have to validate it. Your payment actually equals validation, which means you agree that you owe the debt and the debt is yours. And once it's paid, it does not have to be removed. Okay? So that's why we want to determine who owns the account. If the original creditor still owns the account and if they're trying to collect on it with an internal department, or if they have outsourced it out to a third party to collect on the debt, that account is going to be harder to be removed because remember, the original creditor doesn't have to validate the account. The original creditor is also most likely going to have all of your information on file, and they don't have to validate it. You actually have to find some type of billing error or reporting error to actually get that account removed. And just disputing with the credit bureaus saying that you didn't give your permission for that account to report. You guys, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's not going to work. It's not going to work because, like for an example, if you look at your credit card agreement and terms, you'll see where they tell you that they're going to report that information to the credit bureaus. And you agree to it when you sign the application and start using the card. So they are able to report that information. So you're not going to be able to just say that you didn't give permission for them to report it. When that account is still with the original creditor, you have to find some type of error. Now, that debt collector, you can still try to send them letters and request that they validate it because they don't own the account. And they shouldn't be able to send you any information, which means they can't validate it, so they should remove it. Another example of when a debt collector has it, which is that third party who doesn't own the debt, who's trying to collect on it. For an example, most of the time with medical collections, they just use a third party. They just outsource the collection part out, which means the hospital still owns the debt, which means, say if it was a small amount, and you wanted to pay it, or your insurance paid it, they'll remove that account. Whenever they receive payment, they will remove that account from your credit reports. But I would not pay the debt collector, but you can now because there are new laws out that states once the medical collection is paid, it has to be removed from your credit report. So that was not a good example. Another example, I got one for you. Say if you had an American Express credit card. They still own the debt, but they outsource the collection process to Transworld. That means Transworld owns the debt. It's collecting on the debt, but American Express still owns the debt. But if American Express owns the debt, Transworld should not be reporting on your credit report because they don't own the account. And 9 times out of 10, American Express is still reporting that account on your credit report, which means you're going to be challenging that information with American Express or disputing with American Express. And you have to dispute it differently. You have to actually find, errors or go to arbitration or go to court. You're going to have to actually find a reporting error. So those collections that are still with the original creditor, you guys, they are harder to get removed. I hope that you understand why you need to determine who owns the debt. Now, moving on. The next thing that we're going to need to determine is the age of the debt. We want to figure out if we're still legally liable for that debt. I know sometimes on your credit report, whenever a collection agency buys a debt and then they start reporting it the date that they get ownership of that account. But that's not the correct date. Okay, that's the correct date that they should be reporting, but that's not what you should be looking at to determine if that account is still inside of the statute of limitations. You're going to want to look at when you made your last payment with the original creditor. That's actually what determines when the statute of limitation kicks in. So that's why it's going to be important to find that out. And if it is a debt buyer, they need to have that information. They need to be able to tell you as well. But it's also going to be good if you can go back and find in your records, when was the last time you made that payment to them so that you can figure out the statute of limitations in your state. Now, after we determine those things should help us determine if we should pay that debt. Who owns it? If we pay the debt, are they going to remove it from our credit report? Is the debt actually mine? Do I feel comfortable paying the debt? If it's a debt buyer that owns that account now, have they legally validated? Have they communicated with you legally? Those are all things that you're going to need to look into. Or are you in a big hurry? Do you not have time to request that information from them? If you're in a hurry, like you can pay it. But those things are going to be up to you, you guys. With this information, you should be able to determine if you should pay a collection company, because you're going to figure out who owns it. You're going to figure if the original creditor owns it. Remember, it's just harder, or you have to look for other things. If it's a debt buyer, I'm not going to encourage you at all to pay those, because remember, I don't pay those, and I try not to get my clients to pay those. It's very rare that we have to pay those unless we're in a hurry, unless we have some more things to do, unless we're comfortable with that, unless we feel like, hey, I know that's my debt and I want to pay it. But you guys, there are a lot of different factors that go into determining if you should pay a debt collector. Now, you guys, as a gift to you for staying all the way to the end of the video, I do have a checklist that you can access under this video to help you determine if you should actually pay a debt buyer, or pay a collection, should I say, because collections can either be, remember, with the original creditor or with a debt buyer. So you do have that tool available, and before you pay any collection, you guys, I want you to use that checklist, because I want you to determine if you're legally liable for that account, if that person who's trying to collect on the account can legally collect it from you. Okay? If you guys have questions, please drop them below. I will be happy to answer them. If you're still confused, let me know what you're confused about, and maybe we can dig a little deeper and go into more detail, you guys. Before you pay that collection, I would rather you ask me. Okay? Until next time.